The Walls of Asgard. After the Aesir-Vanir truce was declared after the war, the Aesir looked at the damaged walls that once surrounded Asgard, now turned to no more than a pile of rubble. Their lack of security made the gods uneasy, for the threat of a Jotun attack was always looming in their minds. It took all the gods by surprise, then, when a stonemason came trotting out of the Bifrost, astride a large horse, the tools of his trade strapped to his steed. Odin asked the man what brought him to the realm, and the stonemason simply replied that the gods needed walls built, and the man needed work. Odin looked at the man up and down, and narrowed his eye suspiciously as he asked the mason's price. The man chuckled, and said it would take him 3 seasons to complete his task, for it was a lot of space to enclose. He contemplated his price, and then gave it to the gods, claiming to be a humble fellow with no need for riches nor power. Rather, the man said he was lonely, and said his price was the hand of the goddess Freya, as well as the sun and moon. Odin was furious. How dare this man come to the Hall of the Gods, claiming to be a modest mason, and then name such a ridiculous price? Just as Odin was about to throw the mason through the Bifrost and send him back from whence he came, he heard Loki pipe up. Loki, a mischievous young Jotun who was Odin's blood brother, was known for being cunning and devious, often devising plans to change the whims of fate. An agent of chaos, if you would. Odin looked to Loki and raised an eyebrow, a hand gripping the shirt of the mason. Loki just chuckled and beckoned Odin near. Odin obeyed, reluctantly, and released the mason, walking towards his blood brother. In a hushed tone, Loki explained his reasoning for his hesitancy to send the mason away. For without the walls to protect Asgard, the gods were under constant threat to a Jotun attack. And if Loki's kin were to plan a strike against them, they'd all be at the giant's mercy. Loki tried to persuade Odin to accept the mason's offer, because who else was going to come along and fix the walls? Odin pondered Loki's point, but still refused, noting that sacrificing Freya for protection was out of the question, let alone the sun and moon. Just as Odin was turning back towards the mason, Loki gripped Odin's arm and began speaking again, pulling him back. With a sly smile, Loki explained that Freya wouldn't have to be married off if the mason couldn't complete his task. Odin raised an eyebrow again and asked what he meant. If the gods set the conditions to something the mason couldn't possibly meet, and the mason tried and failed, they'd get the walls of Asgard rebuilt, and it wouldn't cost them anything. Odin grinned a sly smile of his own, praising Loki for such a cunning idea. The ancient god turned back to the mason and agreed to his terms, but stated his own terms as well. The mason would only have 1 season to complete his task, not 3. And the work had to be done entirely by himself, with no help. The mason's mouth gaped wide at the god's counter-proposal, saying it was nearly impossible. And yet, the mason still agreed, stating that even just the slightest chance to win Freya was worth the risk. However, the mason asked the god's permission to use his horse, Svartalfari, to help him drag rocks from the nearby quarry, stating that his steed was in fact an animal, not a person. Odin hesitated, but from the vigorous nods from Loki, Odin was reassured it was still an impossible task, and he shook hands with the mason, sealing their deal. The mason began working that afternoon, setting up camp in the nearby quarry where he began cutting and hauling rocks. With help from his great gray stallion, the mason began to easily move the blocks of stone up the hill and fit them into place around Asgard. The mason's progress was swift, much more rapidly than was comfortable to the onlooking gods. Svartalfari may have been a horse, but it was growing apparent that he was no ordinary horse, just as the mason was no ordinary man. Both partners were too strong and too skilled to be only what they appeared. When only a few days remained before the mason's deadline, Odin called to Loki in his hall, rubbing his temples. What was to be done about their predicament? Only the supports in the front archway were yet to be made, and based on the mason's daily progress, he would undoubtedly finish his task in time, winning Freya, as well as the sun and moon out of the sky. Loki's ever-present grin streaked his face as he waved a hand at Odin, dismissively. The trickster told Odin not to worry, that he had already devised another plan to get them out of the deal, and that all would be well. Odin huffed, unconvinced. The next morning, as the mason was hitching Svartalfari up, a beautiful young mare trotted into the quarry, stealing the attention of the stallion. With a coy turn of her head and a provocative flick of her tail, the mare began to trot away expectantly. Svartalfari, entranced by her, snapped his traces and galloped after her, and the two disappeared out of sight into the distant forest. The mason stood there, mouth agape, stunned by what had happened. Shaking his head as if to work himself out of a fog, the mason began to race after the horses, hollering the whole way at the top of his lungs. The horses were not seen again, but as the sun rose on the first day of summer, the day the mason's task was to be completed by, and the gods looked down from atop their new wall to see the figure of a man trudging wearily up the path from the quarry. It was the mason, exhausted from 3 days of futile searching for his lost stallion. He looked up at the gods, who were all staring down at him, chuckling quietly to themselves over his misfortune. The mason shook his fists and cursed the gods for cheating him. The gods only laughed harder and mentioned it was a fool's bet from the start, and pointed out that the mason had been the dishonest one when they struck the initial bargain. Enraged, the mason began to shake, and suddenly his body grew and grew, until he transformed into his Jotun form and gripped the walls he had built, threatening to tear them down brick by brick. At that moment, another figure was returning home from a distant trip out east where he had just finished hunting Jotuns and trolls alike. Thor strode up out of the Bifrost, an oaken club in his hand — he hadn't gotten Mjolnir yet — to see the shape-shifting giant begin to destroy the newly erected walls around Asgard. With a smile and a yell, Thor sprang on the Jotun, bashing him over the head, shattering the giant's skull into 1,000 pieces, which scattered amongst the rubble of the quarry. About a year later, after many questions from the gods as to where Loki had gone, the trickster appeared at the gates of Asgard. Accompanying him, however, was the most perfect gray colt, who happened to have 8 legs. Loki introduced the colt as his son, Sleipnir, and gave him over to Odin to be his steed henceforth, stating the foal could run tirelessly forever, and could run over water and sky just as easily as he could land. Odin beamed at the gift, accepting him as recompense for the mischief Loki had wrought upon the gods from the mason, and led the colt away to the stables.